So, while the citizens of Bologna were staring sadly at their empty well and wondering where it all went wrong, the rest of Europe was busy cultivating its own brand of specialized weirdness. It's funny how we think of history as this grand progression of progress, when really, it's often just a series of very wealthy people having very long, very expensive bad days. Let's float away from the sunny, bucket-stealing streets of Italy and move toward the somber, sprawling halls of the Spanish Empire. We're looking at Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, Charles was essentially the ultimate overachiever of the 16th century. He was the grandfather of our jaw-challenged friend Charles II, but at this point, the family tree hadn't completely folded in on itself yet. Charles V ruled over more territory than almost anyone in history. He had Spain, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, vast swaths of the Americas, and a good chunk of Central Europe. He was the man who supposedly said the sun never set on his empire, which sounds very poetic until you realize that if the sun never sets, you never get any sleep. And Charles was tired. He was very, very tired. He spent his entire life traveling. He didn't have a fixed capital. He just sort of lived in a series of tents and drafty palaces, constantly trying to put out fires, both literal and metaphorical. He had to deal with Martin Luther, the Ottoman Empire, and the French, who were always being very French at the most inconvenient times. By the time he reached his 50s, Charles was done. He had gout, he had indigestion, and he had a growing suspicion that being the most powerful man in the world was actually a bit of a scam. So, in an unprecedented move, he did what most of us dream of doing on a Tuesday afternoon. He quit. He abdicated. He handed the empire to his son Philip and his brother Ferdinand, packed his bags, and retired to a monastery in Yuste, in the remote Spanish countryside. But Charles didn't go to the monastery to become a simple monk. No, he went there to indulge in some very specific, very gloomy hobbies. He brought with him a collection of hundreds of mechanical clocks. He became obsessed with trying to make them all chime at the exact same second, which, in the 1500s, was about as easy as teaching an emu to play the violin. He would spend hours in a darkened room surrounded by the rhythmic tick-tock of 100 different timepieces, all of them slightly out of sync. It's a very rhythmic, sleepy image, isn't it? Just an old emperor in the dark, waiting for a chime that never quite lines up. But his most famous hobby was his own funeral. You see, Charles became convinced he was going to die soon, and because he was a micromanager by nature, he didn't want the monks to mess up the ceremony. So he decided to have a few dry runs. He would dress in his burial shroud, lay inside a coffin, and have the monks carry him through the monastery while chanting funeral dirges. He'd lie there, eyes closed, listening to the priests pray for his soul, checking to see if the lighting was right and if the chanting was sufficiently mournful. Imagine being one of those monks. You're just trying to get through your afternoon prayers, and you have to carry your ex-boss around in a box while he occasionally pops his head up to tell you that the tenor is a bit flat. It's the ultimate "this could have been an email" moment of the Renaissance. Charles eventually died for real in 1558, presumably satisfied with the rehearsals, but his penchant for the macabre stayed in the family. His son, Philip II, built the Escorial, a palace that was also a monastery and a tomb. It was built in the shape of a grill, because why not honor St. Lawrence by designing your house after the instrument of his martyrdom? Philip was the kind of man who enjoyed paperwork more than people. He spent 14 hours a day at a small wooden desk micromanaging an entire hemisphere. He was cold, he was distant, and he was deeply, deeply suspicious of everyone. He lived in a small, cramped room with a view of the altar of the church, so even when he was sleeping, he was technically at Mass. Let's stay in Spain for a moment longer because we haven't even touched on the madness of Joanna. Joanna of Castile was Charles V's mother. She's often called Juana la Loca, or Joanna the Mad, though historians today suspect she was mostly just a woman suffering from severe depression who was surrounded by men, her father, her husband, and her son, who wanted her out of the way so they could take her throne. Her husband was Philip the Handsome, and yes, that was his actual title. He was called the Handsome because he was, well, handsome, at least by 15th century standards. Joanna was obsessed with him. When he died suddenly at the age of 28, she didn't quite handle it with what we'd call royal composure. She refused to let his body be buried. Instead, she traveled across Spain for several years with his coffin in tow. She would occasionally open the lid to check on him, to kiss his feet, and to make sure he hadn't run off with any other women, which, considering he was dead, seems like a fairly low risk. She traveled only at night because she said a widow should not be seen in the light of day. Picture that, a long procession of torches winding through the dark Spanish hills, a grieving queen, a line of weary monks, and a very decorative lead coffin. It's a slow, haunting image. Eventually, her father had her confined to a windowless room in a castle in Tordesillas, where she stayed for 47 years. 47 years of silence, save for the sound of the wind and the occasional visit from her son, Charles V, who would stop by to see if she was still mad enough to keep locked up. It's a bit of a theme with these royals, isn't it? The transition from absolute power to absolute isolation. You start by ruling the world, and you end by staring at a clock or a coffin in a quiet room. Let's drift north now, away from the heat and the shrouds of Spain, toward a place that was even more isolated and arguably much colder. Let's float over the Alps and the Rhine toward the snowy plains of Russia. The Russian czars were a different breed entirely. If the Spanish royals were obsessed with death and clocks, the Russians were obsessed with size and theatricality. Take Peter the Great, for instance. Peter was a giant of a man, nearly 7 feet tall in an era when the average person was much shorter. He was restless, he was energetic, and he had a very strange sense of humor. Peter created something called the all-joking, all-drunken synod of fools and jesters. It was exactly what it sounds like. It was a mock church hierarchy where the goal was to get as drunk as humanly possible and parody the most sacred rituals of the state. He'd force high-ranking nobles to dress up in ridiculous costumes and participate in 3-day-long drinking binges. If you tried to leave, Peter, who, again, was 7 feet tall and very strong, would personally make sure you stayed. But Peter's weirdness wasn't just about partying. He was obsessed with modernizing Russia, and he decided the best way to do this was to personally cut off the beards of his nobles. He'd carry a pair of scissors and just snip. Because nothing says enlightenment like a giant man forcibly grooming you in the middle of a palace ballroom. He also had a Kunstkamera, a cabinet of curiosities, which was filled with things that would definitely keep you awake if I described them in too much detail. Let's just say he was very interested in biology and peculiarities. He once ordered that a collection of preserved specimens be moved to his new capital, St. Petersburg, and to encourage people to visit his museum, he offered them a free glass of vodka at the door. That's Russia in a nutshell, isn't it? Come for the weird science, stay for the free spirits, and try not to let the giant czar cut your beard off. But even Peter the Great's antics pale in comparison to the quiet, tragic dysfunction of the later Romanovs. But we'll save the snowy silence of the Winter Palace for a bit later. For now, let's just imagine Peter the Great sitting on the banks of the Neva River, looking out at a swamp and deciding, yes, I shall build a city here, and it shall be very cold, and everyone will have a terrible time building it. And they did. St. Petersburg was built on the bones of thousands of laborers, a city of bones and gold, reflecting in the dark, icy water. It's a beautiful, chilling thought. So, while Peter the Great was busy terrifying his nobles with scissors and vodka, another branch of European royalty was taking a very different approach to being eccentric. If Peter was a loud 7-foot tall whirlwind of modernization, our next subject was more like a quiet, flickering candle in a very large, very expensive, drafty room. Let's float over to the rolling hills and mist-covered lakes of Bavaria. We're looking at Ludwig II of Bavaria, often called Mad King Ludwig, though Dream King Ludwig feels a bit more accurate for our purposes tonight. Ludwig was born in 1845, and he was, by all accounts, exceptionally beautiful. He was tall, slim, with dark, brooding eyes and a shock of black hair. He looked like the hero of a romantic poem, which was unfortunate because he had to live in the real world of 19th century German politics. Ludwig hated being king. He hated the ministers, he hated the army, and he particularly hated the idea of having to talk to people about things like budgets or sewage systems. He was a creature of the night. He would sleep all day and wake up as the sun went down, earning him the nickname the Moon King. While his kingdom was being slowly swallowed up by the rising power of Prussia, Ludwig decided to retreat into a world of his own making. He became obsessed with two things, the operas of Richard Wagner and building castles that looked like they belonged on the cover of a fantasy novel. Now, most kings build palaces to show off their power. Ludwig built them so he could hide. His most famous creation, Neuschwanstein, is the one you've probably seen. It's the inspiration for the Disney castle. It sits on a jagged cliff, all white limestone and slender towers. But inside, it wasn't a seat of government. It was a private stage set. Ludwig didn't want guests. He had a dining table built on a hydraulic lift known as the wishing table, which would be lowered into the kitchen, set with a lavish feast, and then raised back up into his dining room. This way, he could eat his dinner without ever having to see or speak to a servant. It's a very sophisticated level of introversion, really. I think many of us, after a long day of social interaction, can relate to the desire for a magic rising table. He also built Linderhof, a smaller but even more gilded palace. In the gardens, he had a Venus grotto constructed, an artificial cave made of iron and glass, complete with a lake, a waterfall, and a boat shaped like a giant swan. Ludwig would sit in his swan boat being rowed around the underground lake while a hidden orchestra played Wagner, and the water was illuminated by some of the first electric lights in Germany. The colors would shift from blue to red, creating a sort of 1870s psychedelic light show. Imagine being the guy whose job it was to row the king in a swan boat in a basement at 3 a.m. It's a very specific career path. But as you might imagine, building fairy tale castles in artificial caves is quite expensive. Ludwig wasn't using state funds, he was using his own money and borrowing heavily, but the government was still panicking. They decided he was mad and unfit to rule. In 1866, a commission of doctors who hadn't actually examined him declared him insane. The end of Ludwig's story is one of those quiet, unsolved mysteries of history. A few days after being deposed, he went for a walk by Lake Starnberg with his doctor. Neither of them returned. Their bodies were found in the shallow water later that night. No one really knows what happened. Some say it was a suicide, some say an escape attempt gone wrong, but there's a certain poetic symmetry to it. The Moon King disappearing into the dark water of a lake he loved, leaving behind a legacy of castles that now bring more money into Bavaria than he could have ever spent. He was called a madman for building them, but today, millions of people travel across the world just to stand in his dream. It's a nice reminder that sanity is often just a matter of perspective and timing. Let's float away from the swan boat and the mountain air and drift toward a place that was much more crowded, much louder, and significantly more dangerous for anyone wearing a crown. Let's move toward 18th century France. We have to talk about Marie Antoinette. Poor Marie. History has been quite unkind to her, painting her as a vapid, cake-obsessed socialite. But the reality was a bit more, well, sleepy. Marie was a teenager when she was sent from the cozy, relatively relaxed court of Vienna to the rigid, ritualistic nightmare of Versailles. Versailles wasn't just a palace, it was a machine designed to strip away every ounce of privacy. Her entire life was a public performance. She had to be dressed by a committee of noble women every morning. There was a specific hierarchy for who got to hand her chemise, and if a higher-ranking woman entered the room, the clothes had to be handed over mid-gesture. There were stories of her standing there, shivering in the cold, while the duchesses bickered over who had the right to put her sleeves on. It's no wonder she wanted to escape. She had a little rustic retreat built on the grounds of Versailles called the Hameau de Narren, the Queen's Hamlet. It was a mock farm with a dairy, a mill, and a farmhouse. Marie would dress up as a shepherdess and pretend to live a simple life, milking cows that were reportedly washed and tied with silk ribbons before she touched them. It was a fantasy, of course, a very expensive, very disconnected fantasy. While she was playing at being a peasant, the actual peasants were starving. It's the ultimate ironic contrast, a queen who wants to be a farm girl, while the farm girls are wishing they could be anything else. And then there was her husband, Louis XVI. Louis was a man who would have been perfectly happy as a middle manager in a hardware store. He loved clocks, just like Charles V, but he also loved locksmithing. He had a secret workshop in the attic of Versailles where he would spend hours filing metal and tinkering with locks. He was shy, he was indecisive, and he had a very unfortunate habit of saying nothing in his diary on days when monumental historical events were happening, simply because he hadn't gone hunting that day. On July 14, 1789, the day the Bastille was stormed, Louis wrote one word in his diary, rien, nothing. He meant he hadn't caught any deer. The world was falling apart, the monarchy was crumbling, and Louis was just disappointed by the lack of forest activity. The tragedy of Louis and Marie was that they were two very ordinary, somewhat dull people caught in an extraordinary, very sharp moment of history. They weren't villains, they were just profoundly out of their depth. They tried to escape, famously, in a heavy, slow-moving carriage that was so luxurious it practically screamed, "We are the king and queen." They were caught, of course, because Louis couldn't help but stick his head out the window to see where they were, and he was recognized from his face on the coins. It's a slow-motion disaster. The carriage ride back to Paris, surrounded by a mocking crowd, the long months of imprisonment, and finally, the end. But we don't need to dwell on the sharp edges of the guillotine. That's too loud for tonight. Let's instead think of Marie and her Hamlet, the silk ribbons on the cows, the smell of damp grass, and the quiet clink, clink, clink of Louis working on a lock in a dusty attic. It's the small, human moments that stay with us, isn't it? The way these people, despite their titles, were just trying to find a corner of the world where they could be themselves. As we move toward the final parts of our evening, let's consider one more royal dynasty, perhaps the most famous of them all, and certainly the one with the most tragic ending. Let's float toward the snowy, silent winter of the Russian Empire, where the air is cold, the jewels are heavy, and the family tree is about to meet its final icy winter. But before we get there, let's take a breath. The candles are burning low, the castles of Bavaria are dark, and the locks of Versailles are all turned off. So as the locks of Versailles click shut, and the swan boats of Bavaria drift to a stop, we find ourselves moving further east. The air is getting thinner, the wind is picking up a certain Siberian bite, and the palaces are becoming increasingly gilded and increasingly lonely. We are arriving at the end of the line for the Romanovs. If you're still with me, nestled into your pillows, imagine the Alexander Palace in Tsarskoye Selo. It's a bit removed from the main buzz of St. Petersburg. It was the favorite home of Nicholas II and his wife, Alexandra. And while the rest of the world saw them as the all-powerful rulers of a vast, mysterious empire, the reality was much more like a very quiet, very stressed-out suburban family, just with more Fabergé eggs and a private train. Nicholas was a man who, in any other life, would have been a fantastic country squire. He loved hiking, he loved his children, and he was deeply, pathologically polite. He was so polite, in fact, that he couldn't bring himself to fire incompetent ministers to their faces. He'd have a perfectly lovely tea with them, talk about the weather, and then send them a letter later that evening telling them they were sacked. It's a very relatable kind of social anxiety, but when you're the czar of all the Russias, it's a bit of a problem. His wife, Alexandra, was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, because of course everyone in this story is related to Queen Victoria. She was shy, deeply religious, and suffered from what people then called shattered nerves. She hated the social whirl of St. Petersburg. She found the balls exhausting and the gossip vicious. So she did what any overstimulated royal would do. She retreated into a private world of incense, icons, and embroidery. But the tragedy of the Romanovs wasn't their social anxiety. It was the royal disease, hemophilia. It came through the female line, courtesy of Queen Victoria's genetic legacy. Their only son and heir, Alexei, had it. In the early 1900s, this was a death sentence. A simple bruise, a bumped knee, or a nosebleed could lead to days of agonizing pain and internal bleeding. Because the family wanted to maintain the image of strength, they kept it a total secret. The heir to the Russian throne was essentially a bubble boy, and the weight of that secret crushed the parents. Enter the man with the beard, Grigory Rasputin. Now, history likes to paint Rasputin as a sort of dark sorcerer or a high-energy villain, but for our sleepy purposes, let's look at him as he appeared to the Empress, a calm, dirt-under-the-fingernails Siberian peasant who seemed to be the only person capable of stopping her son's pain. Whether it was through hypnosis, prayer, or simply telling the doctors to stop giving the boy aspirin, which we now know thins the blood, Rasputin worked. When he was around, the bleeding stopped. Imagine the atmosphere in the palace. Outside, Russia is boiling with revolution in the shadows of World War I. Inside, it's hushed. The Empress is praying in a room thick with the smell of lilies and candle wax. The Tsar is playing dominoes. And in the corner, this unwashed, wild-eyed mystic is muttering stories of the Siberian wilderness. It's a surreal, slow-motion domestic drama played out against the backdrop of a collapsing empire. The nobles, of course, hated Rasputin. They saw a peasant hypnotizing the Tsar. They decided he had to go. And the story of his end is famous for being incredibly difficult to execute. Poisoned cakes, multiple gunshots, a cold river. But the real tragedy was that his death didn't save the monarchy. It just removed the one person who kept the Empress calm. By 1917, the snow was falling heavily on a Russia that had simply had enough. The transition from the Romanovs' quiet, incense-filled rooms to their final days in Siberia is a long, cold journey. They were moved to a house in Tobolsk and then to Ekaterinburg. There's a strange, heartbreaking peace in the accounts of their final months. They chopped wood, they read books to each other, they lived like a normal family, perhaps more bonded than they had ever been when they were on the throne. Nicholas wrote in his diary about the weather and the price of eggs. It's that same nothing-happened energy we saw with Louis XVI, a refusal to let the chaos of the world interrupt the small, quiet rhythms of family life. But we won't go into the basement of the Ipatiev house tonight. That's far too loud and far too sharp. Let's instead leave the Romanovs in a moment of stillness. perhaps sitting on a porch in the Siberian sun, the girls whispering to each other, the Tsar smoking a pipe, and for a brief, flickering moment, the weight of the crown feeling as light as a snowflake. History is full of these heavy endings, but it's also full of these strange, quiet pauses. We've traveled from a stolen bucket in Italy to the clocks of a Spanish monastery, from the swan boats of Bavaria to the snowy silence of Russia. If there's a lesson in all this, and let's be honest, we're mostly here for the vibes, not the lessons, it's that power is a very heavy, very strange thing to carry. It makes people do odd things. It makes them marry their cousins, talk to trees, and hide in artificial caves. But beneath the velvet and the jewels, they were all just people trying to get through the day or the night, just like we are. So, as we drift off, let's be glad for our simple lives. No one is expecting us to rule an empire tomorrow. No one is planning to steal our well bucket. The world is quiet, the history books are closed, and the only thing left to do is let go of the day. I hope these tales of royal dysfunction and feathered wars have brought you a bit of peace. Would you like me to look into another era tomorrow night? Perhaps the strange, obsessive world of Victorian explorers, or the quiet, forgotten lives of medieval monks. For now, though, just rest. The story is over, and the rest is just silence. Good night.